One of the great evangelists of the 20th century was Dr. Bill Rice, lived 1912 to 1978, and he preached all over America and other countries. In one of his sermons, he told this story. He said, "I will never forget the day I was shocked into realizing my own children were not immune to the temptations of the flesh or the wiles of the devil, and that realization drastically and immediately changed our family's life. Here is how it happened. Several years earlier, I was in Palestine and met a famous missionary who had a tremendous influence on me, one of the really great missionaries of a past generation who had been used of God to raise money, build stations, hospitals, and had won, I suppose, thousands to Christ. When he heard on the Jerusalem radio broadcast that my wife and I were visiting in the ancient city, he got in touch with us and said he and his wife would like us to visit them in the valley of Baca. It was one of the most refreshing weeks of our lives, as day by day I went with him as he ministered to people. His house was on a small hill, and just below the house was a low rock wall. And every morning he and I would sit together on that wall and pray for his ministry. He would pray for various people he was trying to lead to Christ, those back in America who supported him. He would place his hand on my shoulder and pray for me. But his prayer would end the very same way every time I was with him. After he'd prayed for the other things I had mentioned, he would slide from his seat to his knees, bend his tired head forward till it touched the ground, and he would burst into tears and would pray for his own children. I was both stirred and amazed. Was it possible this wonderful man had not won his own children to Christ? One morning after we had prayed, we were sitting together, and finally I said, "Doctor, I know this is a very personal matter, but I wish you would tell me, how did it happen that you were not able to win your own children to Christ? I know you're a zealous soul winner who loves the Lord. You love your children, but your children are lost. Could you tell me, how did it happen?" And I'll share more of that later. In 1 Timothy chapter 3, the Apostle Paul is writing about the office of bishop. The word means overseer, referring to the pastor of the church. But in many ways, the key principles that he gives would apply to any man in relation to his home. Read my passage off the screen with me out loud, everybody. Would you please, all together? "This is a true saying, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband," keep reading with me, "the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God?" Now I'm speaking on the subject, how right priorities prevent or solve life's biggest problems. And in this message I want to ask and answer a key question. And the question is this: is a man's home a biblical priority? If it is, what does that mean? An unwise question cannot be wisely answered, but I believe the question I just gave is not only a wise question, but a very needed one. I do believe that it's true that a man's home is a biblical priority. Let me tell you why I believe that. Number one, because life is made up of relationships, and a man's family is his priority human relationship. I remember years ago sitting in a large auditorium with several thousand people and hearing somebody teach what seemed like a simple, basic philosophy from the Bible. But when I heard it, I thought, something is wrong with that, but I don't understand what's wrong with it. Now my guess is this flawed philosophy was taught in our Bible college for decades, probably over a century. When I gave this message about a while back, an older preacher came up to me and said, "I attended a certain Bible college in 1952, and that was taught to the Bible college then, and you're right. Every man I knew who heard that and believed it and followed it lost their wives or their children or both." See if you can find the flaw in this teaching. It went like this. Adam was made first, was made to tend the Garden of Eden. Eve was made second. She was made to take care of Adam. So a man's top priority is his job, business, or ministry, and the wife's top priority is to take care of her husband. Now, what is wrong with that? The problem with that is that it is an attempt to answer a flawed question, and the flawed question is, what is a man's top priority in life? A flawed question cannot be answered. You have to correct the question, then you can give the answer. Did you know the whole gay rights movement, gay marriage movement, now the whole trans movement, all of that? Do you remember that it was all built on one flawed question that people started asking about 30 years ago? Now, I remember when they started asking it. And when they started asking it, at first I thought, whoa, what are they saying? And then I realized, but people did not, you cannot answer a flawed question, but people did not correct the question. And it's all the way to the point now that we actually have somebody running for president of the United States who thinks that it's normal to be married to, for a man to be married to a man. But the flawed question was this: should gays be given their civil rights? You cannot answer that question. That is a flawed question. Flawed question can't be answered. And the reason you can't answer it, you have to correct the question. And the problem with the question is that it preassumes that gays or people, homosexuals, are born that way, and therefore the truth is this: all of us are born sinners, and anybody could become addicted to that way of life. And you have to say, now wait a minute. No, nobody is born this way. Some people, nobody is born a gambler, but everybody's born a sinner. And some people are more likely to wind up being addicted to gambling than other people. Nobody is born an alcoholic, but everybody's born a sinner. And some people are more likely to wind up as alcoholics than other people. Nobody is born homosexual, but everybody is born a sinner, and some people are more likely to wind up homosexual than others. And that's the reason it's better to never experiment with it. What we've got in our day, boy, I'm running a big rabbit here. What we've got in our day, because we have justified it, is we've got more and more, by the thousands now in America, we have young people who are experimenting with it, and then they get addicted to it, and then everybody tells them you're born that way, and they don't realize you don't have to become addicted to any kind of sin, and then there is deliverance through Jesus for any kind of sin if you'll let the Lord help you. Now, let me get off that rabbit, all right? So, the flawed question, that thing I said a while ago about Adam was made first, made to tend the garden, Eve was made second, made to take care of Adam, and so on. The problem with that is that it is the answer to a flawed question. And the flawed question is, what is a man's priority in life? The flaw is in beginning the question with the word what. Life is not made up of what's, life is made up of whose. Life is not made up of things, life is made up of people. And if you follow the reasoning that Adam's top priority was to take care of the garden instead of Eve, then plants are suddenly more important than people. So a better question to ask is, who is a man's top priority as far as life relationships are concerned? And the answer for everybody in this room is the same answer. Read it with me, would you please? The top priority relationship of all of your life should be your relationship with God. And if your relationship with God is right, it will help make all the other relationships right. If your relationship with God is right, then your wife will not mind playing second fiddle to God, because your relationship with God will make you a better husband. When a man looks like this, his wife doesn't have to worry about coming in and seeing him looking like this. And so she wants him to be walking with God. If he's walking with God, he'll deal with the three big sins of men: pride and anger and lust. So the top priority relationship of life for a man is his relationship with God. Who is his next priority relationship? For many men, it's their boss at work or the people who work for them. Many women, the same thing now. And it's easy to get this confused because a hardworking man will have days when he spends more time on the job than he does at home. But the Bible is clear that the next priority relationship of life ought to be your relationship with your wife. Only with his wife is a man to be one flesh. And the next priority relationship after that ought to be with your children. Now, a man's relationship to God makes a husband a better husband, and children don't mind being after the relationship of a husband with his wife, because that's the key thing that makes a man a good daddy. Children don't mind mom's relationship being primarily with dad, because that makes her a better mother. And you can follow this right down the line. Read it with me, would you please? A good relationship with God makes all the other relationships to be what they ought to be. So job or ministry must not come before relationships. Relationships must come before work, job, and ministry, because in the passage I read to you, God made the job or the ministry dependent on the relationships. One that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection, and so on. And there is more there than just something for the pastor or the bishop or leaders in the church. There is a principle that applies to every man in relation to his life's work, and that is this. If you rule well your own house, if you have your children in subjection, then you will know better how to take care of whomever else God places you over in authority. So what am I talking about when I use the word priority? It means that if I ever have to make an unpleasant, difficult, heart-rending, life-changing choice between my marriage and my work, or my children and my job, I will immediately choose my wife and my children. Not because work, business, and ministry is unimportant, but because a man's relationship with his wife is a more important relationship than his relationship with other people. A man's relationship with his family provides the foundation for his success in working with other people in other ministries. I was at a homeschool conference in Washington, in the state of Washington, right outside of Seattle, and a man was speaking, and he said this: my career was my focus, and it was clearly tearing my family apart. I was on an overseas business trip when the problem came to a head, and I realized I could keep going on my trip and keep my career, or I could go home and save my marriage and my family. I took the next flight home. I lost my job. I saved my family. Now, what was that man doing? He was loving his wife like Christ loved the church. What kind of a love was that? It was a love that agonized in the Garden of Gethsemane. It was a love that allowed a crown of thorns to be pressed to his scalp. It was a love that drug a cross in open shame through the streets of Jerusalem and ultimately hung in shame and died for his bride. Did you ever hear the funny story? A classified ad somebody supposedly put in a paper said, farmer with 160 acres wants marriage with a marriage-minded woman with a tractor. When replying, please send a picture of the tractor. Now, what is humorous about that? It's humorous because it obviously makes the things of life more important than people. Read with me, please. Things are only important as they relate to people, and the priorities of life are not in relation to things, they're in relation to people. Things must always come after people. I think if you were to ask my wife, sons-in-law, daughters, or grandchildren the question, which is more important to your dad, his work or you, I believe they would tell you that they are a higher priority. Now notice this. That priority does not hurt whatever ministry God has given or will give me. On the contrary, it is the foundation upon which that ministry is built. What does this sense of priority mean time-wise? It means I must spend whatever time is necessary to do whatever I need to do to let my wife children and grandchildren know they are the number one priorities for me. And I titled this, by the way, my wife traveled a lot with me for the last several years, but in the last year she's not traveling as much. But many times I've said to my wife before I left for a meeting, honey, if you need me to stay at home, then I can stay. I'll cancel this meeting. I'll cancel the flights, whatever I need to do. And you know what? All these years, my wife has never asked me to cancel a meeting. But if she ever did, then I would do it and take care of whatever she needed at home. Now, this is the reason I titled it, How Right Priorities Prevent or Solve Life's Biggest Problems, because if you keep your priorities right, it will solve problems before they can start. But getting problems wrong creates problems all by it. Getting priorities wrong creates problems all by itself that cannot be solved unless you first get your priorities right. A 2011 statistic said that only 45% of Americans considered their families to be a priority. It's probably even worse now. That means that 55% of American homes are now having problems or will be having problems. I was in a conversation with a man who had a 23-year-old daughter who was about to marry a man that this dad did not feel peace about. In fact, the father had asked the young man, will you promise me that you will never divorce my daughter? And the dad said he just looked at me and would not answer me. Now that would shake up any father who's a right-thinking father in relation to his daughter. This daughter was 1,000 miles away from home at a Bible college, and the pastor there, amazing to me, was willing to marry the couple regardless and did not see or respect the father's jurisdictional authority in relation to his daughter. Did you know that when a dad walks his daughter down the aisle and gives her to a man, that what that dad has done is not just some empty ritual? Some people think, well, it's just a custom. Oh, no. The Bible that teaches that at age 20, a son becomes a man directly responsible to God himself. So a man takes a wife, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 5, with his parents' direction and blessing. Nobody should try to get to the marriage altar without some help and some counsel. It is too big a decision of human life. But a daughter continues under her father's protection until she is given in marriage. Then she goes under her husband's protection. And what God is trying to do is always see that ladies are well protected. That's my youngest daughter going on her first date with her daddy. And there is the day that I walked her down the aisle. My conversation continued with this father whose daughter was far from home. And I said, I'm assuming you're talking to her every week on the telephone? Well, no, I'm not. Well, how long since you talked to her? Well, it's been several months. I said, you mean there is a wedding weeks away and you're not talking regularly to your daughter? Well, she's marrying that guy. I said, but she's your daughter. She is your daughter. You have to move heaven and earth to do anything and everything you can to protect her and let her know that you love her. You may not be able to stop her from marrying this guy. She is still a top priority relationship. Your wife is first, your daughter is next. That means anything you have to do to build your relationship with her, you have to do it. He said, well, I'd have to go in debt in order to travel there. I said, you know what? I'm not in favor of debt. But you know what? Do anything you have to do to travel as much as you need to. Be there every 2 or 3 weeks for a week at a time, letting her know that you love her. If you cannot stop this wedding, and legally he could not, then it's time to at least rebuild a relationship with her and build a relationship with your future son-in-law. If you think their marriage may not make it, the only chance you have in the future for them to seek your counsel if they run into problems is if you have a good relationship with them. And if you don't have a good relationship, you have no chance at all. Get there and build that relationship. Now, why should that father do that? Because the lady involved is his daughter. I'm thinking another family I talked to with a rebellious 16-year-old daughter. In this case, because of the parents' jobs, they were both over-the-road truck drivers. And they were gone from home almost all the time. They lost their daughter's heart, and she basically raised herself. And I said to them, you probably have to change jobs. And they got angry and said one of the most foolish things I've ever heard any parent say to a daughter. If we have to change jobs for you, you wouldn't believe what it's going to be like around this house. They should have said, honey, we're sorry. We've been gone so much. It's damaged your life, our relationship. We beg your forgiveness. We want you to know that we love you so much. We're going to ask God to let us find jobs where we can be at home for you. Now, life is relationships. And a man's family, I've got to skip a few things here to save a little bit of time. Life is relationships. A man's family is his priority human relationship. It is more important than his job. And this truth frees not only the man, but his wife as well. And that is true for any wife. But since our text was referring to the office of bishop, let me picture this for you with the pastor's wife. Here's a dozen people in the church who have joined from a dozen different churches. And the pastor's wife in one of those churches coordinated the ladies' meeting. In another, she taught Sunday school. In another, she worked in the Christian school. In another, she played the piano. In another, she sang in the choir, etc., etc. Now, what if those dozen ladies expect the pastor's wife to be the wife of the church instead of the wife of the pastor? Do you know what a pastor's wife needs to be? Whatever her husband needs her to be for him. He has to be the pastor. She has to be his wife. If she'll take care of him, he is far more likely to be able to take care of the church. That's the church where I used to pastor. You wouldn't believe the churches where this is a major problem for pastors' children. They call them PKs or preacher's kids. Mine are grown now, so I can preach about it. But preacher's kids should not have to meet the church's expectations of what preacher's kids are supposed to be. They should please God and their parents. God is easy to please. Jesus said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Parents are more difficult. A church full of people is impossible. No child should be told, you ought to talk or dress or act a certain way because you're the preacher's kid. That is a sure path of bitterness and destruction because that child is then expected to live up to what everybody in the church expects, and that is impossible. Remember the statement from last night? Everybody read those three words? Expectations ruin relationships. A child should do right. Not because he's a preacher's child, deacon's child, anybody's child. He ought to do right because he or she has trusted Christ. All Christians ought to do right. Now notice that every relationship that is dealt with properly becomes a foundation for the next relationships of life, whatever those might be. Read with me off the screen, please. The priorities of life's relationships can be order in which life comes, with any exceptions to that order being outlined specifically by God Himself. So, a child is born. His first priority is to his dad and mom. By the way, that's my dad and mom. He served on the USS Wisconsin in the Navy during World War II. Then to his brothers and sisters. Then his grandparents. Then uncles, aunts, cousins. At marriage, and that's my wedding right there, and I'm feeling all woozy, missing my bride. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary last July. At marriage, a God-ordained covenant shifts the child's priority from the top priority being his relationship with his mom and dad to his mate. This is the verse that does that. And that is the reason that when I counseled couples before they got married, I would say to them, I suggest that you start either now or the day you get married referring to her folks as dad and mom. My father-in-law, this picture was made, my goodness, 17, 18 years ago. He is 89 and a half now and lives with us. And I call him Dad, and I've called him Dad for many years now. And it's special. My father has been gone for 32 years, but it's special because I've still got a dad. It is also true that when my daughters got married, my sons-in-law became like sons to me, and that's critically important that my relationship with them be more like sons, because if not, I may get messed up and choose my grandsons over my sons-in-law. Listen to this advice, this story written to an advice columnist. My oldest daughter was in her second year of college, began to date Carl, who was not a serious student. She managed to maintain a good grade point average, was planning to attend medical school. It became obvious to us that her relationship with Carl was becoming intimate. Her dad had a long talk with her and tried to get her to drop him. She refused. Dad then gave her an ultimatum. If she continued to see Carl, we would no longer give her financial support, which was actually a wise choice on their part. Out of the blue, her grandmother got involved and took her side. Now notice what is happening here. The grandmother is messing up the priority order, and that's the reason you're going to hear about major problems erupting. She bought our daughter a new car and assured her a generous monthly allowance. A few weeks later, Carl dumped Courtney anyway. Months passed and the results of my mother-in-law's interference became apparent. My daughter decided to not go to medical school. Instead, she got pregnant and married a guy that she barely knew. My husband's mother continues to give our daughter money, will no doubt pay the medical expenses for the new baby. As you probably guessed by this time, our daughter no longer wants anything to do with her father and with me. What is happening here? Why is there a problem? Because a grandparent has tried to take over the parent's place in God's order of priority. I gave this message in Florida a few years ago, and a lady looked like she was in her 60s came up after the service. She looked at me and she said, "You know that story you told a while ago about that meddling grandma?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "That's me. And I got the message and I'll be doing something about it." I said, "Well, praise the Lord." Notice this. Right priorities prevent problems. Right priorities solve problems, and wrong priorities create problems. Every relationship properly dealt with becomes a foundation for the next relationship. You ever thought how foolish we are to think that a fellow can have a terrible relationship with his mom and his sisters and somehow or other miraculously overnight turn into a great husband? Oh no. His relationship with his mom and his sisters is where he learns how to treat his wife. His mom is a female. You do know there's only male and female genders. That's all there is, all there ever has been, all there ever will be, all right? And so they are females, and that's where he learns how to treat a female, and his wife is going to be female. And if he's always serving and helping his mom and his sisters, then he will serve and help his wife. A man's home is a priority because God made a man's leadership in his family the foundation of his leadership in other areas. And there's those verses again. So the number one way you prepare a young man to be a pastor, preacher, businessman, or factory worker is to prepare him to be a good husband and father. Read with me off the screen, please, everybody. Whatever you have to do to prepare a son to be a good husband and father is more important than whatever you do to train him to do whatever job or ministry he does. So, if he goes to college to get his brain full of all kinds of knowledge, and with that knowledge, he loses the ability to understand that the top priority relationship of his life is with God, then with his mate, then all the money that was spent on his college was thrown away. I see people spending $100,000 more to send their children to colleges where they just open their brain and take it out and put sawdust in its place. And it's like, is anybody going to wake up and realize how absolutely foolish this is? Read with me, would you please? He will do better if he is the kind of man he should be in his home. Keep reading. Whoever a man has to lead, he will lead better if he is the right leader at home. I've talked to men whose priority was their job or making money. Then they lost their marriage and they said, "You know what? All this money doesn't mean anything now. In the garden, the Lord Jesus told the Father He's willing to give His life for His bride, the church. And the Apostle Paul talked about that. Jesus laid aside the crown and took up the cross for His bride. And there is a spirit about this truth that permeates the life and relationships of the man who believes this deep in his heart. And that spirit elevates a man's wife and children to a proper place that causes them to feel how special they are. That's Brother Gil Bates. He and his wife Kelly have 19 children. I actually called him, talked to him last night for a little while on the telephone. He's in California right now speaking at a church out there, and he's pastor of a church in Tennessee. But he's got this priority thing down. Husbands and fathers, is this sense of priority something you think, live, breathe, and feel, so that your wife and children feel it as well? By the way, we're talking about a husband's love for his wife that causes him to do for her whatever he can do that she needs done. We are not talking about a husband following his wife when she tries to lead him the wrong way, like Eve did for Adam. Now, let me skip on over here. Why is a man's home a biblical priority? Number 3, because of the damage to a wife and children who are not a priority. You do not break God's principles in this area without devastating consequences. Mothers, if your children are a bigger priority than your husband, divorce is often the result. I'm thinking right now of a couple that I knew very well, but her children were a priority over her husband. When her husband did something she didn't like, she divorced him. Husbands, if your children are more important than your wife, devastating consequences. Children, if your friends are a bigger priority than your parents, it can be terrible. There's terrible damage when you don't have the right priority. Picture with me 2 fathers, all right? We got 2 fathers right here. Both of these fathers spend the same amount of time with their wives and their children, but this first one believes that his home is a priority. The second one believes his job or ministry is first, then his home. Did you know that this second man is more likely to have problems in his home simply because his wife and children will sense in their spirits they are not in the order of priority where they should be? The second man may even spend more time with his family than the first man, will probably still have more problems simply because his family will sense that his priorities are not right. When a child feels, I'm less important than a stranger, it creates feelings of rejection, insecurity, and inferiority in the child's life. A pastor was wrongly taught, if necessary, God's work must come before your family. And an older lady overheard it and wisely said, you don't understand. His family is God's work. A man who was once a youth pastor is now divorced and remarried. He had 6 children. None of them are in church. His second wife had 2 children, also not in church. And his testimony was, I was always at church. I sacrificed my family for the kids in the church, so I lost them all, my own kids and the church kids. A man promised his son, we're going fishing on Saturday. All week long, the boy looked forward to a fishing trip with his dad, and on Saturday he said to his son, I'm sorry, son, just too busy. I can't go fishing. A little while later, the boy saw his dad loading golf clubs in his truck. Can I tell you, that's all it would take to turn that boy into a rebel. It would be so easy for that boy to become bitter at his dad. A fourth reason a man's home is a priority is because men who don't understand this will not understand that other men's homes are a priority. Brother Andy Schultz, missionary to Zambia, this is a very old picture now, all right? His children are all grown. But he was at our church in Illinois for a missions conference, And I noticed that his wife was great with child. And I told him about my being gone to a meeting in Missouri in 1978 and missed my third daughter's birth by 18 minutes. I drove 90 miles an hour on 55-mile-an-hour roads trying to get back, and I couldn't get back. And I said, Brother Schultz, when your wife gets ready to give birth to that baby, you clear your calendar and you be there. And his wife Jill went into labor on a Saturday. And he called the preacher where he's scheduled for Sunday to tell him he couldn't come. And Brother Schultz said to me, Brother Davis, the preacher got upset. And I said to him, I'm sorry, I have to stay with my wife. But Brother Davis, if he hadn't told me that, I would have gone. But the meeting was rescheduled. They became one of my supporting churches. I understand there are men in the military who can't be there. I'm saying if a man can be there for a birth, he really should be there. A fifth reason is because of the danger of your not being able to pray. Nothing can hinder a man's prayers more than his relationship with his wife not being what it ought to be. The Bible specifically says that. Men, you have to make sure your relationship with your wife is what it ought to be. What if your child wakes up in the middle of the night tonight, cannot breathe, and you need to get a hold of God and you cannot pray? Why is a man's home a biblical priority? Because life is made up of relationships. And your family is the priority relationship, because God made a man's leadership of his family the foundation of his leadership in other areas, because of the damage to wife and children who are not a priority, because a man who doesn't understand that will not understand that other men's homes are priority, because of the danger of your not being able to pray, and the temporal nature of life itself makes this a priority. I'm talking about the fact that if you live long enough, you are going to grow old. Everybody in this room is going to grow old if you just live long enough. That's me. 2011, I had a heart attack. I'd been going great guns for years and years and years, and I found out you can slow down. In fact, I had a heart attack on Sunday morning during Sunday school. I was back in my office, and it was not a typical heart attack. The pain went away after about 10 minutes. I never went to the hospital. Actually, I preached that morning. I preached that night. I drove to Arkansas on Monday. I'm having chest pain all this time, and I'm thinking that it's pleurisy. I had had pleurisy, which is an outer infection of the chest wall, and I thought the pains felt pretty identical to me. And so I thought, by the way, I got me an Apple Watch. I got this back in September. The whole reason I got it is so I can run my own EKGs. If I have chest pains, I still get chest pains. And I went one time to the hospital. They found nothing wrong, and I thought, I'm tired of that. But I really had a heart attack back in 2011, and I finally got to the hospital on Thursday of that week. And I was in the emergency room, and I said, Doc, I'd planned to mow my yard today, and if you'll let me go home, I'll mow my yard. He walked over, put his hand on my shoulder, looked at me and said, you really don't get it, do you? I said, sir? He said, you've already had a heart attack. You are ready right now to have the big one. We are trying to keep you alive long enough to solve your problem. He said, you don't even walk across this room. Yes, sir. He got my attention. And you know, while I was in the hospital, you want to know why I'm here today instead of pastoring in Illinois? I loved pastoring. I miss pastoring. But I can't be a pastor again. The stress level of a pastor is just off the charts. You can't imagine. Pray for your pastor. But he's doing a great job with it. But while I was in the hospital, my grandchildren came in the room, and one of my granddaughters come walking over to my bedside, and I could see the look in her eyes. I've already lost one grandfather, and I'm about to lose this one. And I took her by the hand, and I said to her, Lydia, I want to promise you that I'm going to do anything in my power to be at your wedding one of these days. And I realized they did heart surgery, everything was fine. A week later, they checked it out again because the chest pain didn't stop, and it just kept going and kept going. The chest pain just kept coming, and I was like, what am I going to do? And I realized my body won't take this anymore. My body won't take the pressure of passion. And people look at my schedule sometime, you know. Last week I was in South Carolina. Week before that I was in Texas. Week before that I was in Florida. And next week I'll be in Missouri. And that's my schedule. That's the way I live. And I love it. And they say, and that is less stressful than pastoring? And I say, oh, much less stressful than pastoring. You just cannot imagine the stress that is on a pastor. And I'm good with that. I'm great with what I'm doing. I'm loving being with you today and hopefully encouraging you and your whole church and your pastor. But the day could come when you become incapacitated. What or who will be the top priority of your life if the day comes when you can no longer work? It better be God. After that, it better be your wife and your children. Read with me off the screen, would you please? If you died today, would your family weep because they missed the relationship or because they missed the relationship? I began with that story. The man who was a great missionary, Dr. Bill Rice, was with him in the Holy Land. Every day he would weep over his children. Dr. Bill finally said, tell me, sir, how did it happen? And very quietly he said, Bill, I just didn't know what time it was. He went on to tell how happy he had been at the birth of his babies. He and his wife had dedicated them to the Lord. Then he was gone from home so much of the time in missionary work. They were off in college and none of them had been saved. He had been so busy preaching the gospel to others, he had neglected his own children. And like so many young people, they thought their college professors were smart people. And those teachers didn't believe the Bible was the Word of God, didn't believe Jesus was born of a virgin, didn't believe in heaven and hell. And the grown children were unwilling to trust the Christ their father preached. And as the missionary talked, his voice broke again and again. And he sobbed as he told of letters he had written, phone calls he'd made, the times he had spoken face to face, all to no avail. Life is so temporal. If you haven't established a relationship with God today, you need to repent of your sins and receive Jesus as your Savior. You do not establish a relationship with God by baptism or good works. It's by faith in Jesus alone. And then I ask you, men, are your relationships in order? Wives, are your relationships in their proper order? Children, are your relationships in the order of priority? Because if not, that alone can destroy the future of your life, your children's lives, your grandchildren. But if you get them in order, that all by itself can solve so many of life's problems.